Well, thank you so much to everybody who is joining us today. We are really excited to be a part of Growth's virtual conference focusing on cannabis. Today, we have an incredible panel around women in cannabis and CBD from the perspective of investors, operators, and accelerators. This is an area that we all care a ton about. Recent reports by PitchBook showed that investing into female founders is at an all-time low over the past 3 years. A report by Women in VC found that female fund managers will take 200 years to be at the equivalent level as male fund managers. And if you look into Black and Latinx founders, it's even worse, with only 2.6% of funding going to those founders. So I'm incredibly, happy and thrilled to introduce a panel of incredible women within this space. We have Alyson DeNardo, who is a partner at UTA Ventures, Amy Margolis, who is the founder of The Initiative, which is an accelerator focused on female founders in cannabis, and an incredible lawyer within the space. And we have Meryl Montgomery, who is the CEO of BARBARI, which is a lifestyle brand within cannabis and CBD. And I am Caroline Jacobs. I'm an executive at UTA Ventures, where I co-run our corporate venture fund and have a wide variety of portfolio companies, including a few in the CBD and cannabis space, as well as a few clients who are building companies within that. So with that, would love to dive right in. Amy, would love to learn a little bit more about how you started getting involved in this space and in your journey to date within it.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm Amy, and I've been a lawyer in this space for a long time, long before anybody called it a space or an industry or anything else. I initially did criminal defense work, and I transitioned with those clients over to the regulatory and corporate side. I started, and I still do that work today. All over, I represent people both on the investor side and on the company side. It's been a really interesting journey and fun to watch what's happened. I started The Initiative, which is a business accelerator for female founders in cannabis, in 2018. We've accelerated 2 classes. Meryl and BARBARI were part of the first class. And we also throw events, although I guess nobody really throws in-person events anymore. And it's been really fascinating to watch what's been happening, particularly for female founders in the space, female founders during the pandemic, and kind of what to expect women in cannabis to do in the next 3 to 5 years as we work towards legalization.
Amazing. Thank you, Amy. And then Ali, would love a bit of your background. I know you come from a more broad focused fund, so I'd love to learn a little bit about.
Sure. So hi, thanks so much for having me today. I found my way to the cannabis space through my investing lens as well as personal interest. Mac Venture Capital is early stage, seed, and pre-seed. Previously, our fund was M Ventures, similar focus. And with an agnostic fund, it gives me a lot of free rein to explore different spaces, and cannabis was definitely one of those things. In all of my investments, both personal and professional, the thing that I care most about is behavior shift and cultural shift. And I think that's something that the cannabis space, and particularly the women in the cannabis space, embodies, of making actual change in behavior, whether it be therapeutics, whether it be alcohol alternatives or things like that. I think that's something that's really important to me and I really love about this space, as well as the direction that we're going. With the uptick in funding, I think it was 2x from 2018 to 2019 in the cannabis space specifically, and then the space that women in cannabis are taking up. I'm really it's been a beautiful thing to watch some of the companies grow. From my perspective, some of the companies grow, and pun intended, and just dominate.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ali. And then Meryl, what was your background? What led you to found BARBARI?
So my past experiences, I've been in New York for the last 10 or almost 12 years actually. And I was working for mostly e-commerce companies, Casper, Mattresses, Glossier, some other larger e-com companies, and I was heading up their content and digital strategies. But, I think I was working in very much of the startup space, and I just kept seeing all of these, young men walking into our office using our conference rooms as like pitch rooms and walking out of there with millions of dollars with less thought out ideas and poor presentations. And I'm like, if these clowns can do it, then I know that certainly I can. And my business partner and co-founder, Valerie, she and I have been friends since college, and I was back in Oregon and we were catching up over drinks back in 2016. And she was saying, I have this idea for a brand and a concept and a product concept, and it was the herbal spliff, which we just launched this last summer. And I called and I was like, very much of the mind of, I was like, that sounds amazing. Like, when you get that started, let me know and I will help you out with marketing. And I called her up about a few weeks later and I just said, I can't stop thinking about it. Like, can I join you on this? And, back at the end of 2016, I think there was just such an energy after the election, and it just felt like such an appropriate time. I was like, no one else is doing this in the space, in the market. And I think, why not? I think if anyone's going to do it, it's going to be us. And so it doesn't hurt to try. And as I said earlier, we've just been trying ever since.
Amazing. And have you found any differences between growing a brand within, the cannabis and CBD space versus brands that don't have as much legalization issues or regulation around them, like your experiences at Casper or Glossier?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think really the best experience that I got with those companies is they were all what was categorized as a disruptive brand. They were all ones that were, cutting out the middleman in some sort of way, or they were disrupting the supply chain in some way. They were innovators in their own space. And so the marketing strategies that comes with working with those types of brands, you have to really be willing to think outside of the box and be really creative with the types of ways that you're meeting that customer wherever they are. The limitations of the cannabis space are obvious, right? Like, we can't use Facebook marketing like Casper can, and we can't find any other sort of ways in. But that's the fundamental elements are the same. It's okay, how are we reaching that audience in creative ways? That route is still very much the same, even though the tools might be different.
That makes a ton of sense. And, you mentioned something about 2016 and that election period. Amy, have you noticed any differences between activity within the cannabis space now, particularly on the M&A side? I know you had mentioned some perspectives earlier that I think could be insightful to share.
The difference between 2016 and now is I'm on Zoom. I think that it's totally different, right? So, 2016, we really still had this kind of like concept of a green rush. There was tons and tons of deal work to be done. There were a lot of transactions. Those were like generally based on completely overinflated valuations. Money was flying around. Founders where I'm reading, and wasn't telling one of you, but I was telling a client yesterday, I'm reading that $1 Billion Loser book about Adam Newman and WeWork, and it's really good. And they were talking about like what was happening and just like venture capital, this idea that like you're just raising to get to your next raise, And we really, really, really saw that in 2016, 17, 18 in weed, which was like people were raising, they were taking the money, they were sticking it in a dumpster and they were lighting on fire. And like, then the next deal would happen. And so I have definitely seen kind of both pre and post pandemic, like that the M&A work has changed. The like acquisition side of this is really different than what we've seen before. This kind of like roll up under a holding company looks very different. I think the appetite for that has changed. The kind of like all these stock deals have slowed. I mean, I don't know if other people are having the same experience, but I'm doing personally a lot more work on smaller transactions, $1 million, $2 million, $5 million deals, cash, and not very many of these kind of like all stock deals. And I think, this panel is about what that means for women. And like, I think what that means for women, just like most things, is that the kind of like opportunity for these small brands that are women led to be acquired is shifting. And that means how women approach fundraising and business building should be shifting as well. So that's what I'm seeing.
Super helpful. And kind of with that in mind, Allie, what do you think makes a company investable right now?
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting, Amy. From my perspective, I'm just pulling up my notes. I think that they're just overarching. There's a lot of companies in the market and brands specifically. Like there are probably, I don't even know, like 100 new brands every quarter or something that we see. And it's a lot. And so I think the brand perspective that's hyper specializing from a consumer perspective of, okay, like a beverage targeted towards moms in the suburbs, or you know what I mean? Like the very specific hyper targeting for the consumers, which is an interesting perspective for me of like, oh, okay, what are we going after? What are we interested in, et cetera. On a more specific level of like actionable things that we look for, or I look for specifically. I think like the company's brand, whether it's a brand or not, what is their brand? What is their mission? What is their ethos? What does the company stand for? What are their values, et cetera? That's something that's really important to me. And I think that's maybe grown since 2016 too, of companies focusing more specifically on values and ethos as differentiation, and to reach their customers. And for me, on the other side of that, that's important because I want my values to match the company's values, to match the consumer values, and have that values aligned capital. That's super important. And then advantage is something that I look for as well. Like, oh, okay, why is this company going to be 10 times more successful than the one next to it? Like, is the founder more driven? Do they have a personal tie to the space? Do they used to work at ease, or you know what I mean? Of what can make this really be successful versus the next company. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the behavior shift of what is this product? What is this company doing to change behavior, either for consumers, for dispensaries, for infrastructure? What is the change that's being made? Like I mentioned before, alcohol alternatives, therapeutics, like changing POS systems, etc. And I think that those are the three things probably that I look for the most as far as like investability.
Super helpful. I really like what you said about a change in behavior. I think that's something we really focus on at our fund as well, is how is this company changing culture? How is it changing consumer behavior? And what will the industry in which it operates, whether that's cannabis, CBD, entertainment, media, regardless, look like, you know, a few years from now? And is this pushing that behavior in a direction that we think makes the world a better or more equitable place? And, you know, kind of what you were aligning with the brand and things becoming more niche, it's interesting because, you know, on one hand, I think, you know, 2 to 5 years ago, maybe brand was enough of a differentiator. And just, you know, for CBD, you know, just being able to launch a CBD company direct to consumer was enough of a differentiator. But now we're at a point where brand is not enough and you need that extra advantage. You need distribution or retail or some key component that really helps set you apart and helps, you know, break from the noise. And I think founders are a really big part of that. And kind of, you know, in line of that, have you, you know, thinking about female founders and how they're attacking this space, is there any advice that you would give to those individuals? You know, Meryl, you are one. Anything from your personal experience that you think could be helpful from others, or any challenges that you face that, you know, have been really informative in your experience?
I think that was to me, right?
I think it's open to anyone.
You know, I think for me, like to your point, having a values-based company myself, it was critical since day one that was going to be a part of our foundation. It's exciting to hear the investor networks be echoing that sentiment. All of our investors are very aware that we are a purpose-driven company, and that transparency is really important, that they understand that the reason why we're pulling our values into our company is for its long-term success, and is really creating the business cases to share why value-based investing and why value-based businesses are in it for the long run. I mean, the challenges that we face as a business are the very same challenges that face our society, right? Global warming and social inequality. And along with a lot of other things. But these are things that really impact us. I mean, even with COVID, we saw such a disruption in supply chains across the board that we have to understand like how these long-term systems really need to be strengthened. And values-based investing and businesses is certainly how to do that. And so I think, we have never, thankfully, even with, at the initiative as well, we've never gotten pushback to be less value-based or to be less ethical. We were always encouraged to really lean into that. And I think that has continued to give us even more of a motivator and a drive and an edge because we've not let it go when we've seen other companies let theirs go.
I can jump in there as well, Meryl. I'm grateful similarly to see the opposite side of it, and I'm glad that that's the case. I think just to echo your last point of something that I previously, my last company, Atrium, I worked for Justin Kahn, was the first employee, hired the first 100 people in the first year, and we were very much a values-based company, and we executed we did our best to execute our values on every single step of the way, whether it be how that we do business or how we interview, even going as far as having a very specific values-based interview during the process of like, okay, these are our 6 values, we're executing against this, how does this person represent these values? And I think that's a very actionable way for companies or for funds or for anybody to evaluate the opposite party and embody those values in a very specific way. And then, Carolyn, what was the first part of the question that you had asked of like advice to give to female founders on fundraising? Okay. And we're just going to keep going on this values train because we're here for it. So when you're looking for investors in the cannabis space specifically, and any space at all, especially as a woman, something that I would always try to do is very specifically target and try to find that alignment of, fund A has values and they give a shit. Fund B is a bunch of white dudes named Chad who don't care about anything. And so you can pick and choose who you let into your company. Sometimes it's not always that easy, but sometimes it's just not taking meetings with people who you don't align with. And that's something I would always try to keep in the back of your mind. And you can always just put that straight out of figuring out the alignment, whether it be values, whether it be check size, whether it be whatever, ahead of time to save your own time in the fundraising process of just sending an email post introduction of, hey, so great to meet you. What's your check size? What's your timeline, etc. This is where we are. Does this make sense? If not, we'll keep in touch for the future. And I think that's a step that often gets missed and can ultimately save your time and save part of your life.
I think I like to just chime in. I think my feeling, and Carolyn knows, my most recent experience out in the universe on fundraising, my feeling is that capital during the pandemic has become more constrained in some ways, and particularly for new deals. And I'm hearing that from lots and lots of people that, investors are taking meetings, but they're really backstopping their existing companies and waiting to see what happens with the election. They're waiting to see what happens with the pandemic, and they're really not deploying capital into kind of new ventures. And I mean, cannabis capital is constrained anyway, and it doesn't have as great an access as other startups might have. So, when you take that and you reflect upon it for female founders or founders of color who, as Caroline said, very much receive less funding than white male founders, that puts female founders of brand new companies in a pickle. And I think that's a real challenge. I don't have an answer. Meryl's probably heard the most about this out of me over the 4 months we spent together, but I don't have a great answer for that. I think it was hard before. I think it's harder now. I still think that there's lots of time to be wasted doing meetings, but it's, I think, going to be challenging for a minute. And I talked to a client, I'm helping a tribe develop their cannabis and THC program, and that's really fun. But their advantage is that they can internally fund. And so they're already 1,000 miles ahead of everybody else who is starting something new. So I don't have great advice for female founders right now. I think it's true that they struggle to get funding, and I think it's going to be hard.
Actually, I wanted
to follow
up, actually, Amy, with an anecdote from our time together. Is and one of the things that I really benefited from was this way of framing conversations with investors, and that sort of bias that are brought into the conversations when an investor is speaking with women or minority women, especially, of framing questions to the CEO in ways that are more, put them in more of a defensive position, rather than questions that open them up for opportunities, and how I can be answering questions that always positions us in the opportunity zone rather than the defensive zone. And so for any founders that are online or anything, I pass that advice along, because it was really extremely helpful in really just understanding that, and how I prepared for meetings and calls, and also how we went into conversations knowing that this is something that we were going to be up against.
Yeah, I think I have two points there. One, I think it was this morning I read the statistic, it's upwards of 65% of the questions that are asked in female founder pitches are defensive questions, which is trash. And B, or whatever, a way that you can, Amy, to your point, a way that you can basically bullshit detector people on why, if they're investing or not, is ask them when the last deal they did was. It's a very targeted question. If they get tripped up, they're probably maybe not telling you the truth. Or if they're telling you the truth, you'll find out what their deal velocity has been during COVID. And that could be a helpful way to try to navigate that, of figuring out which funds are actively investing, which ones are not, and just playing the game.
That's great. I'm writing that one down.
I like to, I think that, raising capital in many ways is like taking the SATs, in the sense that the more you know how to raise capital, the better you will be at raising capital, which isn't necessarily indicative of how you will be as a founder and how you will be as an operator. And I think there's a disconnect in people who know what questions to ask, kind of like you were alluding to, and know how to reposition it into a more offensive position rather than defensive. And if you don't know those things, it's just a lot harder at the end of the day.
Yeah, I absolutely agree on that, being on both sides of the coin in the last few years. It's a game that you know how to play. And I think the SAT analogy is perfect, of figuring out how to answer the questions is half the battle.
Absolutely. Something that I think is really interesting too is the types of investors, who are open to cannabis or CBD in general. A lot of funds have vice clauses attached to them through their LPs that, founders may not know about. And so there could be a fund, that invests in a wide variety of different types of asset classes. There's funds that invest only in cannabis. Meryl, have you found it easy to sort out different types of investors, and what have been helpful resources for you?
So most of our investors, because we just did our first round last year, which was more of a smaller seed friends and family round, we got most of our investors actually at ArcView, which we went to through the initiative. And then from those first few deals, and it was like, yeah, once we got that first yes, then they just started really more snowballing in. And then we just closed, we're still in our bridge round. And from our bridge round, we even our existing investors reinvested in us. And so that has been an incredibly, I think, even just going to ArcView and that experience and our experience with the initiative has plugged us into a network of people that understand sort of what we're all about, and they know what we're coming into, or who we are when we come into those conversations. And so, yeah, I think I don't have much experience. I think, Alyson and Amy probably would be better to speak towards more of the venture funds. But yeah, from us, we just got a great group of individuals that really see the value of what we're doing. And for us, they have a pretty wide range. They are all cannabis investors and have either worked in the cannabis space in some way or just always been on that peripheral. And I think for us, they saw us as somebody that was bringing a new product to the market and a new product category and speaking to an audience that no one else was in their portfolios was speaking to, which is this new and low dose consumer, and people that use cannabis as a tool for their lives rather than just sort of an intoxication. And so I think being able to speak to those productive and sort of the millennial productive cannabis consumers, we were able to really carve out our brand and our niche through that. And then it was an attractive investment apparently. So it worked out.
I think I unmuted myself. I absolutely hate Zoom. I mean, one thing I think Meryl, obviously I love Meryl. And like one thing I think Meryl and Val did really well, and I just had met with another company who was in the same cohort, and they just closed their second round. They opened it and closed it. And I think Alyson talked about it, this idea that can you still disrupt cannabis? And if you can, in what way? And beyond tech. So if you put tech aside and you're tech is tech, and if it touches weed or if it touches, vacation rentals or it touches work or it touches whatever, can you still create a disruptive plant touching company? And then how do you talk about it with your investors? And I think one thing that both Meryl and the other company I talked to over the weekend, and I have a third one is doing their second round starting next week, is that they have managed to, one, create something that's interesting and disruptive, and two, be able to communicate clearly why it's interesting and disruptive. And I had gone on raises with some of these companies, and I have been very impressed having gone on, $40 or $50 million raises with companies run by dudes up to Toronto versus listening to the female founded companies. And what I have always been impressed with is that instead of approaching it, and Alyson, I think I'd love your feedback, instead of approaching it with bravado and bluster, when I've sat and listened to Meryl or to the other companies that have gone through the accelerator pitch, what they are saying is authentic, and it is practical, and it is something that they can actually accomplish. And the expectations are, and we've talked a lot about making sure that you're aggressive with your expectations, but not overblowing it, and where that sweet spot is. And I think we're going to see a shift for cannabis investors where now they want to see profit. Now they want to see, actual revenue instead of just, are you growing fast? And so that's where I think the opportunity for women in this space is that we're not overpromising. We're being ambitious, but we're approaching it in a way that we can be provable every step. And to me, that's where the sea change is going to happen for women. And Meryl's a great example.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Just from my experience in history, seeing pitches both in the cannabis industry with male-led versus women-led is very different. And there are all sorts of statistics about women founders being more prepared, of knowing numbers backwards, forwards, upside down, sideways, and understand. Let me think about this for a second. And to your point of with the male-led companies over promise, under deliver, and the authenticity point on the women-led side, I think that's absolutely true. I think if I hear another pitch that says this is a revolutionary product and we're going to take 100% of this market, I will throw up immediately. I can't, and I won't, and I'll leave. I can't do it. And I think that there's a beautiful contrast with women-led companies, specifically in cannabis, of the level of preparedness as well as the authenticity in every step of the way, whether it be with the values. Thank you so much, Meryl. I'm glad that that's the case. Or with their brand mission, or with their projections of what are the realistic projections, having higher what am I thinking about? Like higher engagement numbers with their audience, higher repurchase rates, sell-throughs, etc., and not like revolutionary 100% of the market. I think that's spot on from my perspective as well. And I have a bias of at some point in my life, I would like to only do business with women for some of those reasons. And I think we're trending in that direction.
Amazing. I want to be mindful of time, and everyone has, really added a lot of value to this conversation. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. If there's, any last pieces of advice, maybe one line or two that you'd like to say for all the female founders or investors who may be watching, would love, some last parting advice.
Amy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I seriously cannot figure out how to unmute my screen. I don't know what the problem is. So my piece of advice, and it is really coming from my heart these days, is like, no matter how shitty it feels, you should leave it all on the field with fundraising. Like, even if you don't raise the money, even if you're like, I hate everybody I talk to, even if you're like, oh my God, this is the worst thing I've ever done. Like, I think the feeling that like, I'm going to go and I'm going to leave it all on the field is something that's like really important. And I would encourage everyone to try it for your next round.
I can hop in next. I think for me, it's more of mindset advice or a mantra, if you will. My previous boss, Justin Kahn, was the one that told me this. Justin's raised hundreds of millions of dollars, started probably 10 companies in his lifetime. And somebody asked him once, you've done all these great things, raised all this money. What attitude do you keep when you walk into pitch meetings? And what he said was, you have to have the attitude of, I'm going to do this with or without you. And that investor might not be a fit, might not be their check size, might not be whatever, might not be in their zone. And I think I carry that with me both personally and professionally, of like, whether I want to go to the beach on Sunday and someone else doesn't, that's not going to minimize my experience. Like, I'm going to do this with or without you. Are you on board? Are you on like off the field? And I think that's helped me so much, both in my career and in my life as a human. And it's just keep that with you, or write it on a sticky note on your desk.
Gosh, thank you for saying that. I'm so glad that one of the questions that we never got to talk about was like, how do you know when you're going to make it? I think that was the way you phrased it. And to your point, I mean, it was that day that I called Valerie and I was like, I haven't been able to stop thinking about this herbal split that you speak of. That was what I knew. I was like, okay, we're going to make it, because we just start deciding to do it right now. So yeah, thank you for that. That's so true. I think for my advice, and speaking as a founder, we have been told, and I think you even mentioned it here, is how valuable that authenticity factor is. But authenticity is something that is a tricky thing to reverse engineer when you when you have to figure out what that means to you. And a lot of times that goes into trusting your own gut, and yes, reading the data that's in front of you and out in the market and comparing that data to how you're doing on your own site or on your own company. Can you tell I have a data background? Because I love it a lot. But that being said, you really have to be able to stick with that vision. So a few years ago, we were getting a lot of not pressure, but conversation pushes to go into the vape space, and that combustibles were on the way out, and that we should really reconsider being a combustible and move into the vape space. And here we are 2 years later, and all these vapes are now hopping over to the pre-roll game, and I am so happy that we stayed where we were. And I think as long as you have that vision and that inner drive, whatever that inner drive is for you, just to keep honoring and feeding that inner drive however you possibly can.
I completely agree with everything all of you just said. It's about believing in your mission and believing in yourself. And hopefully at the end of the day, you can accomplish something great with that. Thank you guys so much for joining.